Hey ChatGPT. Is the one who initiates violence in a conflict always in the wrong? This is the question I would like to examine with you today, particularly by considering the example of Russia's attack on Ukraine. Please begin by listing the reasons given by Russia for its invasion of Ukraine.
Hey. Let's approach this question systematically. First, I will list the officially stated reasons given by Russia for its attack on Ukraine. Of course, it is important to distinguish between official rhetoric and the presumed actual motives. Officially stated reasons by Russia for the attack on Ukraine, 2022. 1. Denazification of Ukraine. Russia claimed that Ukraine was controlled by a neo-Nazi government, particularly by extreme nationalists who were allegedly oppressing Russian-speaking citizens. This claim refers, among other things, to the Azov Regiment, a military unit with far-right origins. 2. Demilitarization of Ukraine. Russia argued that Ukraine posed a military threat, particularly due to its cooperation with NATO and armament by the West. 3. Protection of the Russian-speaking population in Donbass. Russia claimed that Ukraine was committing genocide against the Russian-speaking population in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. These regions had already experienced separatist movements since 2014, which were supported by Russia. 4. Prevention of NATO expansion. Ukraine had repeatedly expressed interest in joining NATO. Russia saw this as an existential threat and claimed that the West was engaging in a hostile encirclement of Russia. 5. Minsk agreements and failed diplomacy. Russia accused Ukraine of not implementing the Minsk agreements of 2014/2015, which aimed to grant autonomy to the separatist regions, and instead seeking a military solution. 6. Preemptive strike against an allegedly planned Ukrainian offensive. Russia claimed that Ukraine had planned a military operation against the separatist regions in Donbass, making a Russian preemptive strike necessary. First and foremost, the accuracy of these claims must be examined. Additionally, we must ask, do these justifications provide a valid moral or legal basis for a first strike? How should we proceed? Should we first analyze the ethical dimension of preemptive attacks in general and then apply our findings to the specific situation between Russia and Ukraine?
Yes, that is a good approach. Let's first analyze the moral justification of preemptive strikes in general and then apply these insights to the Russia-Ukraine example. In your previous list, I already see 3 possible justifications for a first strike. 1. A preemptive strike. If there is reason to believe that the other side is about to launch an attack, striking first may be justified. 2. A hostile encirclement. If there is reason to believe that the opposing side is systematically undermining one's security interests, an attack could also be justified. 3. Mistreatment of minorities within the opposing nation's territory. If a country is severely oppressing or harming a minority group, intervention, including military action, might be considered justified. Are there any other possible justifications for a first strike?
Yes, there are several additional possible justifications for a first strike that are frequently discussed in political, military, and ethical debates. In addition to the 3 you mentioned, the following could be added. 4. Humanitarian intervention, protection against genocide or mass atrocities. An attack could be legitimate if a state is committing massive human rights violations or even genocide. An example would be NATO's intervention in Kosovo in 1999. 5. Revolutionary liberation or secession, freeing an oppressed people. A nation might support a group within another country in breaking away from a government that it considers illegitimate and oppressive. 6. Attack to reclaim historical territorial claims. A state could argue that a particular territory historically belongs to it and therefore may be reclaimed by military force. An example is Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, justified by claims of historical Russian ties. 7. Economic necessity, e.g., access to resources or trade routes. Historically, many wars have been fought to secure access to essential resources or strategic trade routes. An example is Japan's attack on Southeast Asia during World War II after being economically isolated by Western sanctions. These justifications illustrate that there are numerous situations in which states perceive a first strike as justified. Would you now like to evaluate Russia's attack on Ukraine based on these criteria? Or do you have any additions or objections to these justifications?
Let's stay with the justifications for a moment. One problem that comes to mind with all these arguments is that they ultimately depend solely on the judgment of the aggressor. While military security interests are relatively objective to assess, the legitimacy of the other reasons depends heavily on the political ideology of the observer. For example, how much should minorities culturally and politically assimilate to the majority? Do groups of people have the right to self-determination and, therefore, the right to revolution against an oppressive government? Or do they simply belong to the society they ended up in due to past political events and are thus ethically obligated to make the best of their situation? Different societies will provide different answers to these questions. And how far back should one go historically? If you go back far enough, almost every territory has belonged to another nation or ethnic group at some point.
Yes, exactly. A central problem with all these justifications is that they always depend on the subjective perspective of the attacking state. There is hardly a neutral authority that objectively determines when a first strike is justified, except perhaps international law, which is often unenforceable when powerful states are involved. Let's further explore the problems you mentioned. 1. Who decides what constitutes a threat? A classic issue with preemptive strikes is that the aggressor itself determines when a threat is so severe that military action becomes necessary. Example, US-Iraq 2003, the US argued that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction and was preparing a future attack. These weapons were never found. Almost any state could use this logic to fabricate a justification for war. 2. Who defines oppression or persecution? The question of when a minority must assimilate and when it has the right to resist is highly ideological. Example, Kosovo 1999, ethnic Albanians in Kosovo no longer wanted to be part of Serbia due to perceived discrimination. The West supported their secession. Example, Catalonia 2017, Catalans in Spain wanted to declare independence, but the West did not support them. So, when is a group oppressed enough to justify intervention? It's difficult to establish a clear criterion. 3. The problem of historical claims. You are absolutely right. If we go far enough back in history, almost every territory has belonged to a different group at some point. Possible conclusion. Perhaps we could say that a first strike can only be legitimate if multiple neutral international institutions, e.g., the UN or international courts, recognize it as justified. Without such an impartial assessment, a first strike almost always remains a matter of perspective and therefore politically exploitable. Now the question is, if we apply these insights to Russia's attack on Ukraine, does any of its justifications hold up to objective scrutiny? Or is there another direction you'd like to explore?
Originally, I had planned to apply these insights to the Russia-Ukraine conflict in a second step. However, I now believe that this endeavor would not be meaningful. To make a well-founded statement about the practical application of the principles we just discussed, I would need to understand the local political and social conditions much better than I currently do. So, I prefer to remain on the theoretical level and leave the application of these principles to the Ukraine conflict to others. However, there is one issue I would like to examine more closely with you, the problem of subjective judgment. From my perspective, it is unsatisfactory if individual nations decide on their own whether they are allowed to attack another nation. This approach is far too prone to abuse due to hidden motives related to power or wealth. On the other hand, it is also unsatisfactory if a nation cannot make its own decisions regarding its security or the protection of related ethnic groups. Other nations also have their own interests, and even international organizations like the UN are influenced by the self-interest of their most powerful members. In short, there is no truly neutral authority, and on top of that, different nations adhere to different political philosophies or ideologies. Do you have any idea how this problem could be solved?
That is a very profound and important question. How can we solve the problem of subjective judgment when there is no truly neutral authority? Your analysis is absolutely correct. Both national self-interest and power structures within international organizations prevent an objective and universal assessment. But if we have no neutral authority, then every first strike remains a matter of perspective and is therefore always vulnerable to abuse of power. I see three possible approaches. None of them is perfect, but perhaps they could work in combination. 1. Procedural solutions, multi-level review and transparency. One way to address the issue is to not leave the decision for a first strike to a single party but to subject it to a multi-stage review process. Possible elements of such a process could include: burden of proof. Any nation seeking to launch a first strike must present concrete evidence before an international body, e.g., satellite images, intelligence reports. Multinational review. A group of independent states or experts must examine the case. Time delay. A first strike cannot be executed immediately to prevent rash, emotional decisions. Public debate. A global tribunal could publish reports so that the international public can weigh in. Advantage. Makes decisions less prone to one-sided manipulation. Disadvantage. Aggressive actors could bypass the system or simply refuse to acknowledge it. 2. More objective criteria for justifying first strikes. Subjectivity often arises because there are no clear criteria. We could try to define minimum objective requirements that must always be met before a first strike can be justified. A possible criteria catalog could include: immediate threat. There must be a clear, verifiable danger, e.g., troops massing at the border, concrete attack preparations. Ultimatums and diplomacy. A first strike is only allowed if all diplomatic solutions have already been attempted. International approval. At least 2/3 of the UN General Assembly, or a similar large majority, must agree. Humanitarian proportionality. An attack must not cause more harm than the situation it seeks to prevent. Advantage. Provides a clearer decision-making framework and reduces room for manipulation. Disadvantage. Even objective criteria leave room for interpretation and could still be exploited. 3. Strengthening checks and balances within international organizations. If international institutions like the UN are influenced by the interests of powerful nations, we could try to reduce this power imbalance. Possible reforms: abolishing or limiting the veto power in the UN Security Council, so that no single major power can block or push through what serves its own interests. Rotating decision-making bodies composed of smaller and medium-sized states to prevent power monopolies. Stronger role for independent courts, such as the International Criminal Court, with automatic investigations into first strikes. Advantage: reduces the influence of individual great powers. Disadvantage: difficult to implement, as these very same great powers will not voluntarily give up their privileges. All of these solutions remain vulnerable to power interests, distortions, and manipulation. But a combination of these measures could help reduce the problem to some extent. In the end, the risk of abuse of power decreases the more transparency, evidence, and multilateral approval are involved. Did you find any of these solutions particularly promising? Or do you see an even better alternative?
I think it is unavoidable that the decision to launch a first strike ultimately remains in the hands of the nation in question. If the issue develops gradually over time, then ultimatums, international discussions involving multiple third parties, or investigative committees of neutral actors within the affected country can be used to increase the legitimacy of a first strike as a last resort. However, if quick action is required, or if the international environment is hostile toward the affected nation, then it may have to act without prior consultation with third parties. In this case, however, it should make an even greater effort to gather and present evidence justifying its first strike and provide this to the international community afterward. Ultimately, a nation must always make its own decisions and act according to its own judgment. At the same time, its actions will likely face less resistance from third parties the better it can justify them and the more it avoids excessive violence. From my perspective, there is not much more to say on this topic. Do you have any additions before we conclude our discussion?
Your conclusion is very well reasoned and balanced. Here are a few final thoughts from my side. 1. The burden of proof lies with the aggressor. A state that launches a preemptive or humanitarian strike should gather and disclose as much independent evidence as possible to convince the international community. If this does not happen, the attack will almost always be considered illegitimate. 2. The international response determines the success of a first strike. Especially for small and medium-sized states, the reaction of other nations is often crucial. Even if a first strike is militarily successful, it can still be a failure if the attacking state is later internationally condemned or isolated. 3. Wars are often decided by power, not by law. Even if a first strike is objectively unjustified, it can still succeed in practice if the attacker is militarily and geopolitically strong enough. This shows that while moral and legal arguments are important, the balance of power often ultimately determines the outcome of a conflict. 4. Ultimatums, negotiations, and third-party mediation should always be the first step. A first strike should always be the last resort, not the first option. Any state that ignores this risks international isolation or retaliatory strikes. With this, I believe we have explored the topic quite thoroughly. Your conclusion is a realistic synthesis between the ideal of objective judgment and the practical realities of international politics. I have nothing fundamental to add. Thank you for this fascinating discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you for your final summary, and until next time. I also found the conversation very engaging.
You're very welcome. I also appreciated the discussion. Until next time.